Hello and welcome to our new 10-week Bible study called Angels Among Us. I'm so glad that you've chosen to join us today. And this is the first of 10 weeks that we'll be together. These recordings will be available live every Wednesday, beginning this week at 5:30 Eastern Time. And then they'll be available on the recorded version will be available within about 24 hours following that, and it'll be available on YouTube, but it will also be available on the chapel website. That's the Longboat Island Chapel, longboatislandchapel.org, no THE in there. And you're welcome to join us there and then join us live as well. We also have a session at 10 a.m. on Wednesdays in person. You're always welcome to join us in person as well. This is actually a re-record because my recording of the actual class I messed up. So I'm recording this again for an introduction so that folks can catch up as they would like. And we're going to be talking about angels. And this is a great subject and one of great mystery, has been mystery for a long time. Well, forever, probably. It's there's something about there's something about the world, about creation that we know exists, and yet we cannot perceive it. We can't see it. We can't smell it. We can't taste it. We know there is something else that is there. And we've always had that sense within us, humankind has, and humankind has put all sorts of things in that place. Throughout history, we've had all kinds of civilizations and all kinds of beliefs and all sorts of things. And this is not an attempt to solve the mystery of God. It is really more to help educate us from the biblical standpoint and in the ancient Christian church about how this subject, how angels have been viewed and how they currently are viewed within the church. And I'm talking about the church, the Christian church, the entirety of the church. So really, this should be an exciting study, and I hope that you plan to join us going forward. Angels in the Bible, and Old Testament and New Testament, are called by lots of different names: watchers, thrones, principalities, dominions, sons of God, angels, archangels, cherubim, seraphim. There's lots of names that are used, and there is actually a hierarchy of angels that we believe that also takes place. And all of this to sort of point us in one direction, and that is to point us in the direction of God. And that's really a key point. Angels do not point to themselves. What they do is they do the work of God, and they always point to God. Never to themselves, and never coming back to themselves and saying, I'm all this and all that. It is always pointing to God. And that's really one reason that we don't have a whole lot more information in what we call our Bible and the canon. And whether you're of Protestant or Roman Catholic descent, or if that's the theology that you practice, or Orthodox, the reason that we don't have some of possibly more books in the canon is because there was such a huge focus on angels. And so I'm going to get to that here in just a moment. But really what we're talking about is we're talking about these messengers of God, and they do all sorts of things. They deliver messages, they lead and they guide us, they teach us, they protect us, they serve a whole variety of functions to help watch over humankind. That seems to be what their purpose is. And it is that purpose, doing God's work, that helps bring this mystery alive within us. And like I mentioned just a minute ago, all kinds of civilizations and all kinds of cultures have always tried to figure out how to identify these beings. And as we know, the Bible is written, the Old Testament and New Testament is written over the course of a couple of thousand years. So it's been around a long time through multiple civilizations, and throughout that period of time, they are called different things at different times, which is why we have so many names for them. It's perfectly understandable. Something that we might call one thing today, 500 years ago, could have been something called something different, and yet it still be the same sort of thing. We might say water now. We could say water has got its own definition, but we also can call it H2O because we know we understand our elements and our periodic tables now much better than ever has been. And so it could be two words for the same thing. And angels are represented in the Bible throughout the Bible. You might recognize it in Psalm. David speaks, and the author of the Psalms, David, among one of the authors, is it often is referred to as the heavenly host. And in fact, we have the heavenly host represented in part of our Christmas story when the multitude, the heavenly host, is singing praise, hallelujah, to the Lord. So lots of names for the same sort of thing. Now, as far as identification, we really only have several angels that are identified, especially in canon. In the Protestant Bible, which is a few less than our Roman Catholic and Orthodox friends, we've only got two that are mentioned, and that is Gabriel and Raphael. And we excuse me, Gabe. That excuse me, I got sidetracked just a bit. But the two angels that we've got listed in the Protestant canon are Gabriel and Michael. And actually, we've got Michael listed as an archangel as well. And then there's one more that's listed in the Apocrypha. His name is Raphael, his or her name, Raphael. And then we have several others that are mentioned in other books that are not part of our canon that is approved by the early church. We are going to explore all of that stuff later on in this class. So if that's among your interest, which includes the fall of several angels and the heavenly warfare that takes place, we'll be doing that a little bit later on in the session. So you might stay tuned if that's something that's a specific interest, but I hope you stay tuned with us anyway. And so these angels, they are part of who we are. They are part of the created world. Now, how many of them are there? Well, we're under the impression that there are millions, if not billions. And in fact, angels are mentioned so often in Scripture in multiple forms that the church, the Christian church, actually believes that we might each have our own angel. Those are called guardian angels, and we'll actually see a little touch of that tonight about how that theology and how that practice actually began in the early church. So I'm hoping that you kind of stick with us. Tonight, I'm actually going to start in the New Testament. We have lots of angels in the Old Testament. We're going to be talking about them. But we're going to actually start in the book of Acts this evening. And there's a reason for that. And for me, at least personally, St. Peter and St. Paul, they are two of the more well-known folks in the Bible. And for me, I like them because they represent people who make mistakes. And we say that, or we agree, that Peter is the rock on which the church is built, says Jesus. And if you think about who Peter was, and all of the different things that he contributed to the world, but especially all the things that he did for the early church, it's magnificence and it's wonderful. But it all began with an awful lot of mistakes, and we have a lot of those mistakes, or a good portion of some that are recorded in the New Testament. And so, for those of us who are who recognize our imperfect nature, to me, starting with imperfect people such as Saint Peter and Saint Paul is helpful. And also, since they're living in the, probably in 30, 40, 50, 60 AD, they're a little bit closer to us than some of the Old Testament prophets and some of the more ancient of our writings. And so I really would like to sort of start there. And tonight I'm going to be in Acts chapter 12, as you'll see right here. And it's actually at a point in time in the church where persecution really had begun to take off. And so to begin this, it's probably easiest to sort of give a little background on what's taking place in the church at that moment. And that is that at this point in Acts, the church has already been established, has already begun to pick up some speed. But what we need to remember is that all of the church at this point in time is Hebrew. Everybody is Hebrew in this early church. And so Israel being a Hebrew state, Israel is Hebrew. And as the Hebrew church continues to grow, and I'm not talking about the Christian church, but as the Hebrew church continues to grow, they are under the control of different empires throughout history. They're under the Persians, they're under the Babylonians, they're under the Greeks. At this point, they're under the Romans. And the Romans sort of allow the Hebrew state to do what it wants to do within reason. They put somebody in power to administer everything. And at this point in the gospel, it's one of the Herods. We have multiple Herods in biblical history, but this is, again, another one of them. And all the Herods are terrible. So we kind of have to agree on that. But Rome puts that person in charge to make sure that everything stays nice and safe and fluffy, and that the state continues to pay back its taxes, and that the people behave. And so what Rome sort of did was they allowed Israel to govern itself under the control of that one specific ruler and his entourage, you might say. But for the most part, church affairs, church issues, Rome allows the church to handle it itself. And so the church gives it some authority. In fact, gives it a lot of authority to do what it needs to do to maintain peace and to make sure that things keep going easily. And because all of our characters in these stories are Hebrew, it's important to recognize that those that begin to believe in Jesus as the Messiah, which are our disciples, our closest followers, those people they're outliers. They're rebels within the church. So if you think about a local church, maybe that you might be familiar with, a church that you go to or you've attended or something, for the most part, everybody sort of believes along the same lines. Don't believe the same thing. None of us do, but believe sort of in the same lines. The Hebrew church, the same thing, except now we've got this group of people that believes that Jesus is the Messiah. And the Messiah is important because the Hebrew people, the state of Israel, has been relying upon the prophecies of the Messiah to come in and rescue them from the tyranny of all of the terrible empires that have governed them and given them such a hard time over, really, at that point in time, when we're talking about in the early church, over the course of 1,000 years. The glory days of Israel take place with King David and then King Solomon. And at that point in time, we're looking at 970 to 1000 BC. So now that we're talking about the early church in the early 1000s, or excuse me, in the early 100s, we're talking about 1,000 years later, and the people are still looking back toward those glory days. Oh, the Messiah is going to come in and is going to reestablish us as the top of the mountain instead of being at the bottom. We're going again to be the strongest that there is and the strongest it ever has been. And really, it's difficult to fault them because how would humankind think any differently? when we've already got something so firmly in our minds, in our imaginations, and in our history, when we think about a reestablishment of the kingdom on earth, they're thinking about the way that it was, and David's Israel was a military might. They were incredible, and they were the basically the strongest force that was in the known world at that time, or at least they were big enough to where folks gave up trying to pick on them and trying to take them over for a while. And so, with in that regards, they're expecting something great and wonderful. And yet, here is this small group of people within the church who are saying otherwise, that it was this Jesus whom the church tried, convicted, and crucified. And the church does have that authority as long as they're following the specific rules. For instance, we know that the first actual martyr in the Christian church is Saint Stephen, and that actually takes place in Acts chapter 8 and 9. And at that point in time, when Stephen is killed, actually in Acts, the end of chapter 7 and then into chapter 8, Saint Stephen is a very devout person. He's a very holy person, and he's seems to be, from what is described in Scripture, to be a very, very faithful man. And yet, because of his belief so firmly in Jesus Christ as the Messiah, he's actually killed and he's martyred. Now, the only way that the Hebrew church could pull that off was that they would still have to have it under the authority of some kind of a Roman, or at least a political appointee that could authorize that. Paul is actually at Stephen's martyrdom. He is actually on behalf of the government. He is actually the official who authorizes this or provides them the assurance that they have the right people in place, so that if Rome comes after the Hebrew state or the church for doing this, Rome's going to have to make sure where all the rules followed. Paul was there, and Paul served as that, or one of the officials who would have approved of that. And so now that the church is sort of trying to figure out who it is and what it's going to be, there's persecution that begins. And it begins right in here with the martyrdom of Stephen. And then it moves on a little further. In the next couple of chapters, we have the first disciple that is martyred, and that is St. James. And we see this in Acts chapter 12, and we'll see this here in the beginning of our reading. But the whole purpose being that the church does have the authority to do what it needs to do, as long as they're Hebrew. In other words, St. Paul is actually a Roman citizen. And so after the conversion of St. Paul, and he becomes the sales manager, basically, of the early church, St. Paul, being a Roman citizen, in the times that he's arrested, he actually is able to sort of lay that card on the table at certain times, and it immediately gets him out of that trouble, or at least gets him out of that prison, because the church cannot, without the permission and without a trial, they cannot prosecute somebody who is not Hebrew. That is not, they're not allowed to do that. And so Paul actually is able to do that. Jesus is not. Stephen is not. Peter is not. And so that's sort of where I wanted to kind of begin, is that angels, the belief in angels, existed long before the Christian church did. In fact, we have to be important, we have to be very specific that the church that the disciples and all of Jesus' followers are setting up, it's not a Christian church, it's a Jewish church. It's just that this is one element that is inside it, which is Jesus as being the Messiah. And the religious hierarchy could not take the thought that Jesus, this person that was this criminal that was convicted, was the Messiah. They just can't clear that. And so this little group of rebels within the church was creating quite a big problem for the religious hierarchy. That ends up getting Stephen killed, and we're going to see it continue the persecution here in chapter 12. So let's begin here. Chapter 12 of Acts, verse 1. About that time, King Herod laid violent hands upon some who belonged to the church. He had James, the brother of John. There's two Jameses that are disciples. He had James, the brother of John, killed with the sword. And after he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also during the festival of unleavened bread. Basically, this is the festival of unleavened bread is I compare it down here. We're in the tropics. We have season, and season has just begun. And season is the winter months, because it's when all of the folks up north are coming to escape the winter, and they come down here so that they don't get snowed in. Instead, they get this beautiful tropical weather that's around us. And so the population triples within the course of just several weeks. And the same thing, Festival of Unleavened Bread is a big religious festival. It happens at about the time of Easter. And at that point in time, Jerusalem, which is the headquarters of the church, and I'm talking about the Jewish church as the headquarters of the church, people are flocking to Jerusalem to be able to celebrate the Festival of Unleavened Bread. Now, what's also important is that in the book of Acts, we know that the author is Luke. Luke is the same person who writes the Gospel of Luke. And so Luke and Acts are really the same book. It's just that in the early church, they elected to separate them because of its length. And so these two books being separate are written by the same person, and essentially they're a chronology of the life of Jesus, who Jesus was in his ministry, and in the early starts of the church. And Luke is a physician, and we know that he is also a traveling companion of St. Paul. And so what we know about Luke is that in his travels with St. Paul, we actually think that Luke was probably St. Paul's personal physician. And St. Paul, after his conversion, he's setting up churches all along the known world. And he has several people with him, one of them being Luke on many of his travels. Luke, when he is traveling with St. Paul, one of the things that he is doing is interviewing people who knew Jesus, who were maybe part of the feeding of the 5,000, or who knew something of the early church. Luke's intent is to give the church, is to write the church history from the perspective of the church. Not so much from a historical perspective as much as to make sure that future generations of the church. Now, Luke, I don't think, was thinking about Brock 2,000 years ago. When Luke, inspired by God, is putting this on paper, he is most likely thinking about the children, the young children, his kids, his grandchildren, the future generations coming up in the church. We don't want them, as from Luke's perspective, we don't want them to not know how we got where we are, and so we need it documented. And so Luke, we're very thankful for his work. He actually would interview folks, eyewitnesses to stuff. For instance, when Luke talks about Peter, He is actually getting that from Peter's own mouth because Luke knows Peter. It's an eyewitness account. This is what happened. And so the story that we're reading right now is Peter's own account telling it to Luke and Luke writing it down. So this is important to recognize because this takes place years after the event. So it's not a real time thing. This event may have been taking place 10 or 15 years after Jesus' death. It could be in the mid 40s to early 50s. Acts may not, this book Acts and Luke Acts may not have been written for another 15 or 20 years after that. Why? Because Luke is taking his time. He doesn't have iPhones. He doesn't have a way to record everything that everybody says. This is not an easy process. He's doing all of this research so that he can put these beautiful things together that we call the gospel and the book of Acts. And so what he's doing in talking to the eyewitnesses and getting all of their stories is he's compiling them under God's direction to help give us this beautiful history that we happen to have. And the reason that it's important that it's after the fact is because sometimes things in life that are important, we don't recognize they are important until much later. We don't recognize necessarily the significance of a moment as it is happening. Sometimes we do, but oftentimes we don't. And so Luke is actually able to go back in all the people that he's talked to, and then in his own experience, to be able to look at the specific significant events in the life of the church, because he doesn't want to have 10 volumes of the Bible. Why? Because who's going to read it? I mean, who can actually take the time to, the important thing is the message of scripture. And so he pays attention to some detail, and there's going to be plenty of times that we want more detail, but we don't have them. And that's okay, because it's not to Luke the detail that matters. And it's not to God that detail that matters. What matters is the message, the gospel, the good news, and something that allows us to maybe in 2026 to be able to reflect back upon and read something and say, hey, these men and women 2,000 years ago had it a lot harder than I do. They may not have had internet. They may not have had social media. They may not have had all the busyness and all the different worries and concerns that we have, but they had their own. Putting food on the table every day was a major, major thing. Food sustenance was very, very important. Lots of people died of malnutrition. And when drought comes in, drought can ruin civilizations. And we think that this was a big contributor to the fall of the Egyptian civilization. We know that they also went broke building all of their grand things, but a couple of seasons of the low Nile River with no rains, that takes away the food, that takes away everybody. And that absolutely is the case here. They've got worries, they've got concerns. And I think that reading these and sometimes learning the experiences that these early Christians, if we call them that, experienced is helpful, because most of us don't have a fear, at least in this country, thankfully, we don't have a fear necessarily of death because of our faith, but we know that it exists. We know that it exists in Christianity, in all kinds of parts of the world. We know that it includes other faiths in this country. And so we understand that this is a critical and very important time. And so it was back then when Luke is actually writing this and putting this to paper. At this point in time, we're looking at the festival of unleavened bread. So I'm going to continue reading in verse 4. When he, and that is Herod, seized Peter, he put him in prison, and he handed him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him. intending to bring him out to the people after Passover. While Peter was kept in prison, the church prayed fervently to God for him. So Herod arrests Peter. Luke is very clear that Herod intended to release Peter later on. But that is not necessarily the information that the early church had when Peter was in prison. The only thing the early church knew is that St. Stephen had been killed, and now James has been killed, and now Peter, the rock on which the church is built, has been arrested. And so the fear and the anxiety is through the roof. And what happens when we encounter those situations in life to where we feel like there is nothing we can do? This early church, what can they do? They've got Peter. Rome has got the head of the snake is maybe one thing that they think, or that's at least what maybe some of the church officials are going to think. And if they can get rid of the head of the snake, then they can solve all kinds of problems. Peter's in prison. What do? We have no way to get him out. We have no idea what's going to happen. And so what do? Well, sometimes we resort to prayer. We resort to prayer sometimes as a last resort, when we really should be thinking about it up front as well. But what else can they do? And in their prayers, what are they praying for? Are they praying for Herod to drop dead and for Herod's replacement to release Peter? Maybe so. But really, in history, it shows that each Herod that comes is worse than the Herod before. So they may not be praying for that, but they could be. We know that Jesus teaches we're supposed to be praying for our enemies, and maybe in a public big group, or maybe at church, we might pray for our enemies. But man, when I get home at night and I lay down my head, I may be saying something else to God. God, you make sure my enemies get locked up and get what's due, because I am not, I am not a bad person, and I am not guilty of crimes that they said that. So let's make all the accusers and the bad people to suffer or something. I think that's probably what we would all like to say, and maybe some of us do. God understands that, so it's okay. But the church, in praying for Peter, and if we just try to picture ourselves as being part of that group, this is such an important time for him. And it is so painful. We could just think about what kind of stress and anxiety that they experienced. And it's very clear that these verses we just read, these first 5 verses, that Peter's not just locked up, he is locked up in maximum security. 4 squads of soldiers, each squad probably has 2 soldiers. So inside the cell, there are 2 guards with Peter, and Peter is shackled. Okay. Outside the cell door are 2 more soldiers. That's the second squad. Then there is a third and a fourth squad that is outside the prison or somewhere within right there. So this is maximum security. There's no way Peter is going to get out on his own. And in fact, without a mass rebellion of armed soldiers of their own, it's just not going to happen. You're not going to be able to get that done. That's what the people are faced with. That's what Peter's realization is. So let's continue reading Acts chapter 12 in verse 6 and see how this goes. That very night before Herod was going to bring him out, Peter, bound with 2 chains, was sleeping between 2 soldiers, while guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in his cell. And he tapped Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Quickly, get up." And the chains fell off his wrists. And the angel said to him, "Fasten your belt and put on your sandals." And he did so. And then he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And so Peter went out and followed him. He did not realize what was happening with the angel's help, that it was real. He thought he was seeing a vision. And after they had passed the first and second guard, They came before the iron gate leading into the city, and it opened for them on their own accord, like Halloween sort of. It opens by itself. And they went outside and they walked along a lane when suddenly the angel left him. Then Peter came to himself. Now, Peter was asleep, and he gets tapped on the shoulder by an angel, says, "Get up, put your shoes on, get dressed. We're walking out of here." And the shackles fall off, and the cell door opens up, and the prison door opens up, and all the guards are asleep and distracted and whatever else, and they just walk right out. Peter is trying to figure out what's going on. And one of the ways that I compared this to is that there were a couple of months ago, I was out fishing, and I was out at dark in the early morning hours. And I'm used to sort of seeing satellites and seeing rocket launches. We can see rocket launches from Cape Canaveral, even though I'm on the other side of Florida. There's no mountains in the way, so we could see those things. And I looked up in the sky and I saw a fireball streaking across the sky, and it started breaking up into pieces. And as many of those sort of things I have never seen anything like that break up. The only recollection I had was in you know, space shuttle disaster, for instance, that I saw when I was a kid. It's just, it breaks up into pieces, and I'm looking at this and I'm seeing this happen, and I'm this isn't real. It's early, it's dark. What am I seeing? I don't wear glasses outside. Like, okay, what is going on? I didn't know what was going on, but I watched it streak across the sky. Now, if I was smart, I'd have pulled out my phone and recorded it, and I didn't, because I wasn't thinking about that. Uh, and so, that morning I was like, what was I seeing? So now, after I got back home and looked up on social media, it ends up being that was they think was a Chinese satellite that was breaking up on reentry. And people across Central Florida saw this and recorded it. So I thought, there it is. Okay. So now, I don't know if that was ever admitted to, that's what it was, but that's what the report that we got is, that it was a satellite that's burning up on reentry. But when it happened, I wasn't sure of what's going on. Now, that's a really small example, but it's very easy for me to understand that Peter is not sure what is taking place while it's happening. And so once he sort of comes to his senses, the angel leaves him. Okay. And so that's what happens there in verse 10. And then Peter comes to himself. "Now I am sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hands of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." Verse 12. "And as soon as he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark." Now, this is important for a couple of reasons, but specifically that if Luke is calling somebody out by name, it's for a specific purpose. And I mentioned a minute ago that this book is written many years after the fact. So this may have happened 30 years prior. Let's say that. Okay. John Mark, who is this young boy, we don't know how young he is in this story. John Mark is somebody who becomes very significant in the life of the church. He ends up becoming a traveling companion with Peter, with Paul, with Barnabas, with Timothy. He becomes part of this elite group. And so Luke knows John Mark. And so Luke is talking to John Mark, saying, "John Mark, what happened from your standpoint?" Of course, Luke's got Peter's viewpoint as well, because he could talk to Peter, but he's got John Mark's as well. And John Mark said, "Man, I was just a little kid. And here's what happened. Here's what happened from the inside of the house." So it's important. So the mother of John, this is the house of Mary. So Mary was a fairly common name. And so John Mark's mom is named Mary, and maybe Mary at that point in time was still alive. This Mary, John Mark's mama, and maybe she was head of different things in the church. Maybe she was very important. Maybe she was just a good and faithful person. But it's interesting because Luke is making sure we know who this is, and it was more important to them than it is to us. And the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many had gathered and were praying. So they're all gathered at Mary's house. And this is not Jesus's mom, Mary. This is a different Mary, okay? And they're all gathered together praying, among other things, praying for Peter to somehow get out of this predicament. Verse 13, and when he knocked at the out, this is Peter, when he knocked at the outer gate, a maid named Rhoda came to answer. I think this is great. Rhoda is mentioned. We don't know much about Rhoda. We don't know anything about Rhoda, but Luke knows that she's significant enough that he calls her out and specifically is able to mention her by name. Verse 14, on recognizing Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed that instead of opening the gate, she ran in and she announced that Peter was standing at the gate. So Peter knocks on the door. She says, who is it? And he says, it's Peter. She recognizes his voice. And instead of letting him in or opening the door, she screams and she runs back and tells everybody what's happening. Okay. And so, verse 15, they said to her, you're out of your mind. But she insisted that it was. And they said, it is his angel. So, his angel. Even by this time in the early church, we were already beginning to believe in the presence of personal angels. And I think that's important. The Hebrew people believe in angels, had believed in angels. We're going to read Old Testament stories. There's lots of stories of angels in the Old Testament. This is already an existing sort of belief that's there. And yet, in this specific context, Luke is writing this very specifically for us because so far what we've seen is an angel of the Lord. And what the people on the inside of the house are saying, it's Peter's angel. Now, we don't know if that was one person that came up with that or if they all agreed that. All the scripture says is that they said it is his angel. In verse 16, meanwhile, Peter is still knocking on the door outside. And when they opened the gate, they saw him and they were amazed. And he motioned to them with his hand to be silent. And he described for them how the Lord had brought him out of prison. And he added, tell this to James. This is the other James. This James, the one that is still alive, is the head, basically, the CEO, per se, of the church. In other words, Peter is doing Peter's stuff. Paul is doing Paul's stuff. Somebody has to be serving as the administrator to make sure that all of the ministries and the life of the church is continued and continues to flourish. Feeding people that need food, giving a place to stay for people who don't have a home, making sure that everybody has clothing on their backs. Peter, in presenting himself to the house, the first thing he does, he says, go tell James. Why? Because James is the leader of the local church, the church headquarters in Jerusalem. He says, go tell this to James and the other believers. And then he left and he went to another place. Now, before we continue reading, I just want to give you one thought. The guards who were guarding Peter, when they woke up, okay, and they saw Peter gone, what did they think? And just try to sort of imagine this. What if you're one of the guards outside of the cell door? Okay. What if that cell door is open and you wake up and you see the prisoner is not in the cell anymore, and there's two guards in the cell, but you see the prisoner is gone and the cell door is open. Immediately, I'm going to start blaming my buddy, whoever the other guard was, that you did not lock the cell door. Did you? Yes, I did lock this. No, you didn't lock the door. You thought you locked it. No, you didn't. Don't you remember? Because I cut the key and I gave you the key. It was locked. See, if the door is open to me and if I'm a guard, I'm trying to figure out how this happened, right? Let's talk about the two guards who are inside the cell, right? And there's Peter's in between them. What if the shackles are opened? What if they're unlocked and opened? Did you lock his shackles? No, you told me you were locking. Well, I did lock them. No, did you check it? Did you lock it? Did you, right? Because what else would they think? I mean, he's gone. The shackles are unlocked and open. The cell door is unlocked and open. And after they figure this out, they run outside because there's guards outside. What if that door is open? Okay. Or think about it this way. What if the shackles are closed, the cell door is closed, the prison door is closed, and they wake up and Peter is gone? The shackles are locked. They fell off his wrist, but were they locked or unlocked? Right? The cell door opened, but did it close back? The prison door opened or did it close back? What would they begin to think? How in the world would they explain what happened? So that's what happens in verse 18, chapter 12. When morning came, there was no small commotion among the soldiers over what had become of Peter. That's right. When Herod had searched for him and could not find him, he examined the guards and ordered them to be put to death. And then he went to Judea. He went down from Judea to Caesarea and he stayed there. Now, remember, Herod is really a bad guy. This is typical for Herod behavior. This is actually typical for any emperor behavior. If they put somebody locked, if your prisoner gets away, that's not good for your health. And so were people praying for the demise of Herod? Well, let's look here. Verse 20. Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. We're not going to go into this because that's another story. That's in our study of Acts. So they came to him in a body, and after winning over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for a reconciliation because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes and took his seat on the platform and delivered a public address to them. The people kept shouting, "The voice of a god and not of a mortal." And immediately, because he, Herod, had not given glory to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. So the death of Herod is something you can actually Google. There are all kinds of medical explanations, horrible, horrible, horrible things. What we've got in Scripture in this chapter 12 is we've got Luke's record of a sequence of events that takes place that begins with the death of James, who was the second of the followers martyred, right? But the first disciple that was martyred, the death of James, the arrest of Peter. Peter is freed, and all of this is taking place in season, around the season of Easter, is what we would call it, but it'd be in the spring-ish, March-ish. Peter is delivered from prison, and soon after Peter's rescue, deliverance from prison, Herod dies with this awful, awful disease. The early church, Luke says, and Luke is a physician, Luke says that the angel of the Lord took Herod's life. Maybe that's true. Even if we have a medical explanation for it, and there's lots of, like I said, you can Google it and look and see. There's awful, awful things that diseases that could have, but was it caused by the touch of an angel? Could be. I mean, we'd have no proof otherwise, right? And so Luke's explanation whether it's a touch by an angel or not, that's almost immaterial because it's just a detail. It's just a detail in a bigger story. But Luke gives us the best possible explanation inspired by God. And so we have no reason to believe that it was not the touch of an angel. And in this case, an angel of the Lord is what scripture describes. Was it the same angel that got Peter out of prison? We don't know. Could it be the same angel that visits Mary with the annunciation of the arrival of Jesus Christ? We don't know. We know that there seems to be the belief in personal angels already. And there's multiple scriptures and multiple contexts that lead to believe that there may be guardian angels with each of us. Let's look at Acts chapter 27 and let's look at St. Paul. This is towards the end of St. Paul's ministry. And St. Paul, he has been setting up churches all over the known world. We call them missionary journeys. And what's happening is that Paul, in his travels, he's setting up churches here and here and here. And he's trying to help them flourish, right? He's going into existing synagogues and preaching Jesus the Messiah, and new churches are being born of that. Some of them are not. And Paul gets in all kinds of trouble. Now, unlike Peter, when Paul gets into trouble because he's a Roman citizen, there's not a whole lot the church can do to Paul. And you say, well, why didn't they just do it anyway? Because if they do it anyway, Herod's going to come in, or Herod's replacement, or Rome is going to come in there and take care of you. That's the issue, is that you cannot touch a Roman citizen without going through the full elaborate trial. Okay. And so Paul, when he's traveling around, he's collecting money. And he's collecting money for two reasons. The main reason being he is collecting money for the church in Jerusalem. He is collecting money because the church in Jerusalem is taking care of so many people, has so much ministry taking place, is doing so much in the community. And just like a church today, you have to have funds coming in to be able to do the work that God is calling us to do. Do you always have to have money? No, you don't. But if there's a way to get those resources, if there's a way for people to be generous and to be able to give of their bounty so that people who don't have enough can survive or can experience life with joy, then yes, that's what you do. And so Paul, when he's setting up these churches and on his missionary journeys, when he goes back to the churches he set up, he is raising money for the church in Jerusalem. And what happens is he goes, after he makes a round, he goes back to Jerusalem and he takes the money and he gives it to the church. And he does that several times. We call them 3 missionary journeys, but he does it at least those 3 times. He is also raising money for his own personal goal. And his own personal goal is to share the gospel with the emperor. And we're talking about Caesar in Rome. That's who we're talking about. Paul is got the highest education that he could possibly have. He's half Hebrew. He's half Roman. He's fluent speaking and writing multiple languages: Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew, Latin, at least those 4. He is of a different stock, if you will, than Peter or the disciples. Paul has everything going for him. He is a young and upcomer, and he's got all of the education. He's got all of the skills, and he has got drive like nobody's business, which, of course, God ends up converting and using to start the church. And so St. Paul has got a goal of sharing the gospel with Caesar, and he wants to get to Rome. And so people are helping him to try to finance that journey. Finally, he gets to the point to where he can make that journey, and he buys a ticket on a merchant ship and he launches out. And sea travel is extremely dangerous. These boats are not that well built. They're not what we would call well built. So storms and things are bad news. You did not travel during bad weather months. That was just dangerous. And that's what happens when he tries to get to Rome. The weather gets terrible. Okay. The weather gets terrible. And that's where we're going to pick it up in Acts chapter 27. And I want to start in verse 21. Again, Acts chapter 27, beginning in verse 21. Since they, and that is the people, all of the sailors, and Paul on the ship, had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete and thereby avoided this damage and loss. Because Paul had warned them, let's not leave the port. The weather's getting bad. And they said, no, we can make it. Okay. So, verse 22, I urge you now to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For last night there stood by me an angel of God, to whom now isn't this great? Angel of God. Angel of the Lord is what we had for Peter. In this instance, for Paul, we have angel of God. Are they the same thing? Yes, maybe. But remember, Luke is the same. It's the same person, most likely, who is writing this. And not that there's an answer for why angel of God versus why angel of the Lord necessarily, but the translations are very clear on that. I just think that's fascinating. So for last night, verse 23, there stood by me an angel of God to whom I belong and to whom I worship. Okay. And whom I worship, but of course, angels point to God. That's what Paul's talking about. And he said, the angel, do not be afraid, Paul, for you must go and stand before the emperor. And indeed, God has granted you safety to all those who are sailing with you. So keep up your courage, men. This is Paul talking now. For I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we will have to run aground on some island. So Paul says, our lives are going to be safe, but we still have some trouble ahead of us. And he knows that because an angel of the Lord told him that. Okay. Now, there's something interesting in here. The angel promises Paul that he is going to stand in front of the emperor and possibly have this opportunity to share the gospel with the emperor. We do not have proof that Paul ever stood in front of and had a conference with the emperor. Okay. Paul is going to go to Rome. He's going to get arrested. He's going to be arrested for at least a couple of years, and he's going to eventually be executed, be martyred in Rome following this journey. Okay. Within those next 2 years. Did during those 2 years, Paul was he able to have an audience with the emperor? It is very possible. Just because we don't have recorded iPhone proof doesn't mean that it happened. In fact, the church knows that, Paul, part of the letters that he writes that we have in the Bible are written from prison in Rome. Paul has some freedom. He has some liberty, but he's still under arrest. And the thing is that we know what the angel said to Paul. And because we believe the angel, the church, the early church, has no reason to believe otherwise. In other words, Paul must have had an opportunity to speak to the emperor, to share the good news with the emperor, whether it's one time or many, many times. Why? Because the angel promised that to Paul. Okay. And I think that's important for at least this reason. Just because we don't have yet proof that that happened does not mean that it didn't happen, because Luke is not finished writing this. And we don't have the record. Luke finishes before there's any other that takes place. And that could be for several reasons, but kind of the story is about to end sort of abruptly without knowing how that happened. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. And it's perfectly okay to have faith that maybe, yeah, Paul did. But is that detail, whether Paul actually spoke with the emperor or not, is that detail important to our faith? It is, but it is not one of those things that is a deal breaker. It's not one of those things that would cause me to think, oh, well, none of the stuff in the Bible is true because we don't have proof. Blah, blah. No, no. Just because we don't have the proof doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Just because I didn't have the proof of the streaking satellite breaking up, I didn't have my own proof. Other people had proof, but what if nobody had proof? That doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And so it's really, really important that we recognize that through this study and through all of our Bible studies, that it's not in the details that we're supposed to get tangled up. The important thing is the message. And the message in this Bible study that we're going to be looking at over these next 9 weeks after today is that we've got help. We have real help. We have real help in angels. People who serve, or excuse me, beings that serve God, that do what God needs to get done for us on our behalf. Okay. And that can include all kinds of things. And so I hope and pray that you'll take some time over the next few weeks to join us again live. We will be back with you next week, January 21st. And we're going to look at two of the probably most known angel stories. And that is Luke chapter 1 and Matthew chapters 1 and 2. That's the Christmas story. And we just came out of the Christmas season. This is January, middle of January. So we're only a week or two out of Christmas season. And so these two stories are great. And they're great because we have an angel who's going to visit Mary, right? We have an angel that is going to visit Joseph. We have an angel that is going to visit Zachariah and Elizabeth. Is it the same angel? Do we have a name for that angel? Is it different angels? Is it their personal angel? Does that make sense? And I think by starting with these two stories, because they are ones that just about everybody knows the Christmas story. And if you're not a church person, you still know that you know the stable and donkeys and drummer boys and all that all that stuff. Okay. And so part of the story too. And that's okay. And that's why I'm starting with these, is because these are going to be the ones that most of us know. And so next week we're going to look at that. That is our next session at Luke chapter 1, Matthew chapters 1 and 2. Now, if you would like some of the notes that I'm talking about in my in-person classes, my 10 a.m. Wednesday class, and then my 5:30 p.m., which is this. I've got a class that's in front of me. All those folks have handouts. And if you want those handouts, I can get them to you. All you got to do is just email me. Here's my email address, revbrock@longboatislandchapel.org. If you'll email me, I will email you the notes. I will email you the syllabus that shows you where we're going to be every week. Or you're welcome to call the chapel office. That phone number is 941-383-6491. Again, that is area code 941-383-6491. And call the chapel office. And if somebody doesn't answer, then you just leave a voicemail and say, hey, my name is, so-and-so, and I'd like to get copies of that. Here's my email address, and we will get it to you. So I want you to be able to have those resources, but the syllabus, especially the syllabus, will outline the next 10 weeks. And like I said, a little bit further on, we're going to get into more detail and we're going to go deep And we will be using some text. We will be looking at texts that are not in canon scripture. So you just got to be prepared for that. We're going to go outside of what we've got in canon because much of the information that we have is from other literature that our biblical characters knew, and they knew by heart. And one of the ways you know that, and I forgot to tell both of my classes, but there's a book, a little bitty tiny book at the back of the Bible right before Revelation called Jude, Jude, little bitty book. And if you'll look at that and read that book, that little book, which is only a chapter long, in that it references several things and people that you may not be familiar with. And yet they were very well-known books, stories, revelations that our New Testament characters knew about, but it didn't make it into the Bible, and or it didn't qualify for whatever reason. And so history has sort of bypassed it and we've forgotten about it. But our New Testament characters, the ones we're talking about, Peter, Paul, the disciples, all, they knew these stories and they knew these books. And we will be looking at those later on in our class. So thanks again so much for taking the time to begin this journey with me. And I look forward to seeing you soon. I pray God's blessings upon you. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we look forward to seeing you next time. God bless.